Right. Today we have a slight change of plans. Instead of talking about postbacks, which many of you seem to already have the idea of based on the code that you did, where you have a page that submits back to itself, in which case you need to know which mode the page is in, whether it's the first time the page is loaded or if you are calling it back, which you usually test the button to determine that. At any rate, we're going to cover, instead of that, we're going to cover Ajax. And a couple things about Ajax. Ajax is not a programming language. So we're not going to be learning a new programming language. We're going to be using PHP and JavaScript just as we did before. The only difference is we're going to use it in a slightly different way. All right. The way we've been using PHP and JavaScript before is JavaScript runs on the client side, PHP runs on the server side. When we request a page, all right, let me bring up this diagram. In classic web applications, the communication model was we would request a page from the server and get back a response, which was always this response here in the classic web application. We would always get back a complete web page. That is, would get back JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And the browser would display it and would have some client-side JavaScript that could do some things to make this page more interactive. That's what we've done so far. For example, the example we went over the last couple lectures. We have this, we request from the server a page, let's say the chart page. We send the request to the server, we get back from the server an HTML page. Or we get the calculator and we have some JavaScript in there that can do some things. But when we request a page, we get back an entire web page. And if you notice, the page changes that way. All right. In Ajax, we don't have that. Our initial request is the same. So the first time we request a page, we're going to get back a complete web page. But every time after that, we're going to be making JavaScript calls that are going to make a slightly different kinds of request to the web server. It shows it as an HTTP request. Actually, it's an XML HTTP request. And we're going to get back not a complete web page. We're going to get back a chunk of data. And our JavaScript code, which this Ajax engine is a part of, our JavaScript code is going to process that and change the way the page is displayed. Let me give you an example you probably have all seen before. If we go to Google's homepage, we have a text box here. And if we start typing in the text box, we see the most common searches for the letters that we've typed in so far. So let's say, for example, I want to type in, I want to do a search on Ajax. So I type in A. It will show me the most common searches for the letter A. Amazon, Amazon Prime, Airbnb, and so on. I type in a J. Shows the most popular things for AJ. I type in another A. It shows me a soccer club. I type in an X, and then finally, it shows me Ajax. Interestingly enough, it doesn't show me Ajax in a web development way, so maybe we'll type in another letter, a few letters, web development, to get that. Now, if we think about this, we know that client-side scripting is involved because when we type something in, the response is immediate. We don't see the page flicker. Like if I refresh this page, you can see the page flicker up here, even though it's quickly because I'm on a quick connection. But when I type in stuff here, I don't get that little flicker. So this is happening on the client side. we're changing the page that we've already loaded. We are not loading a brand new page. And yet, if we think about it, pulling the most common list of search terms from Google's database seems like it's a server-side activity, right? Because if you remember, when we talk about server-side activities, we talk about sort of the heavy lifting. We talk about interacting with databases, interacting with other systems or applications, and whatever. So therefore, this seems to be a mix of client-side and server-side, which it is. This is an example of an Ajax request. So we go to google.com. That's our first request. We get back a server request that has JavaScript, HTML, and CSS in it. We type in, as every time we type in the text box, it makes another request to the server and gets back data. So if I type an A, it requests in the server for request from the server the top web searches that begin with an A, and it gets back a list of those in some format. All right. Ajax stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML, and oftentimes the data we get back from the server is in XML format, but not always. We get back the data in some format, and then our code takes and creates HTML and maybe CSS for the new data that was presented. Okay. So that's going to be what we're looking at today. How do we do this? How do we accomplish this? How do we have our JavaScript make a request to the server? How do we request not a complete web page, but just some data? All those things are the questions of how we do Ajax. So I have taken and did the calculator just so that we can contrast it. I took this calculator and I redid it as an Ajax application using just JavaScript. Now, for your first assignment, I'm going to want you to do it using only JavaScript and not Jquery. All right. The reason I'm doing that is I really want you to understand exactly what's going on before you take the shortcut of using Jquery. So notice how this behaves. If I type in the age and the beats per second or beats per 6 seconds, notice again, I'm not going to see a flicker here. I get the results immediately. So the page, a new page didn't load. Compare that with this example where I type in the age and the beats per 10 seconds. And I go to another page. We can see the little flicker in the tab because it's loading a new page. Even though it's very quick, there's a hesitation. Now, in this particular example, because I'm working on my own local web server and so on, it's going to be a very quick response. And even with Google, it was a very quick response. But in other applications, it's possible that there may be a delay. It may take some time to reload the new page. As opposed to this, where we do not reload the page. And yet we also, in the same case, we call the server to get the results. So that is a result of the calculation that's done on the server side. So this is similar to what we saw in Google, where as you type things in, it narrows it down and you see suggested search terms. Now, the interesting thing is with Google uses a interesting algorithm to get your suggested search terms. In other words, yours and mine might be different depending on our interest and what I've Googled for before and what you have searched for before. It might also depend on the location. So their algorithm is very complex, and by necessity, it runs on the server side. So if I were going to type in Italian restaurants, notice it shows Italian restaurants, Amherst, Ohio. All right, because it knows that's where I'm located, and Lorain, Ohio is nearby. All right. So if you were to type that in and you were in Elyria or North Ridgeville or something like that, you're liable to get different results because it uses a lot of criteria, not just the most popular search terms, but it uses a lot of things to come up with that list of the most likely things that you're searching for. All right. So that has to happen on the server side. That can't be done on the client side. Now, in our case, if push came to shove, we definitely could do this on the client side, but we're doing these calculations on the server side just to demonstrate how that works and how we can get an update to a page without requiring a load of a new page. So let's look at, refresh our memories. Let's look at how the calculator worked using the traditional method. Using the traditional method, oh, I opened up the wrong one. Calculator. Using the traditional method, after the validation was performed, we would submit the page to this second page, check range. And again, it's possible that we will submit it back to itself. All right. But in Ajax, we're not going to actually submit the form. When we submit a page like this, we're going to get back a complete web page. And that's what we get because we're going to call check range PHP. And check range PHP is a complete web page. Has the title, has a style sheet, has the header and the nav and the results that we're going to get there. Now let's compare that with the calculator in Ajax. All right. Let's start by looking at the form. The page, by the way, is a complete web page for the initial load. So when the page loads initially, we get this web page coming and delivered to the client from the server. And that includes all the HTML that we had before, all the CSS that we had before, and all the JavaScript we had before plus more. We have actually what they termed in that diagram the Ajax Engine. And that's what these functions create: request object, make Ajax call, handle response. That's what they end up doing. But the form. All right, let's look at the form for a second. First of all, notice there's no action or method on the form because we're not going to be doing a conventional submit of this form. Remember, when we submit a form, all right, so if this was a submit button, it's not, but if it were a submit button, we would call whatever the action is, and that action would reload a complete web page for us. We're not going to be submitting, though, and making a request in the way we have done in the past. We're going to make our request through JavaScript. All right. So therefore, we have a button. All right. And that button simply calls a piece of JavaScript that says process form. Right. Now, what does process form do? It validates the form, and if the form is valid, it calls make Ajax call. The validation of the form is very similar to what it was before. I check to see if, I initialize the variable to true. I check to see if the age has a value. Again, I'm not doing a lot of validation here on the client side. because I'm doing, there's validation done on the server side as well. But I'm doing a little bit of validation here to make sure I've at least entered something in the text age field. And if I have not, I just change be valid to false, and I set the error message, and then I display the error message and return B value. So if this validated correctly, I get a value of true here, and I'm going to end up making the Ajax call. Otherwise, I do nothing, and we stay on that form. So going back to what we have here, if we're on the Ajax calculator, I type in a value, or I don't type in a value for age. I click calculate. It gives me the fact that I have a missing age. So it called process form called validate form returned to false. So I do not go and make the Ajax call. All right, so far, it's very similar to when we used the traditional web application way of doing things. Now, let's say that we've passed validation and we've put in valid values here. Let's trace through what happens. All right, we do get a response here, and that response came from the server. All right. So let's look at the functions and the stuff that has to do with Ajax. First of all, I create a request object. Now this code is kind of old, all right, but it's still there for backwards compatibility. So if someone's using a very old browser, this will work. If someone's actually using an old version of Internet Explorer, this will still work. I create a variable called HTTP, and that equals the result of this create request object. Nice thing about this code is you can take this code and you can actually put it in an include file if you wanted. Put it in a JavaScript file, because you're going to be doing this every time you do a JavaScript Ajax. What does that do? It creates a request object. It looks at the browser property. If the browser is Internet Explorer, it creates the return request object this way. Otherwise, it creates the request object this way. So it uses one of two methods depending on the browser to create the request object, and then it returns that request object. So after this instruction runs, the variable HTTP contains our request object. Think of the request object as the pipeline going between the Java code, JavaScript code, and the PHP server code. So if we look at our diagram here, if we were to sort of wrap all of this stuff in a pipeline, into one sort of pipe, that is the code that's represented by the XML HTTP request object. So that's the pipeline between the client and the server for my Ajax calls. All right. Now that I've created the object, I can do stuff with it. What can I do with it? Well, my make Ajax call gets called if the form validates. And let's see. I'm going to define the URL I want to call. All right. I want to call checkrange ajax.php. All right. We'll look at checkrange Ajax in a few minutes here, but that's the URL we want to call. And we want to add to that URL the value of the age and the value of the number of beats in 10 seconds or in 6 seconds. So we add to that URL query string elements, txt age equals, and the age plus ampersand txt beats equals, and the number of beats. I then tell the pipeline to open that URL. All right. So it's creating the pipeline between the client and the server. And the server script that's being called is the value of this URL. I then create what's called a callback function. All right. The A in Ajax stands for asynchronous. Asynchronous means it's not going to be synchronized. You know, it means not synchronized. So therefore, it's not going to be like when I call this function, immediately I'm going to have the results. I'm going to get the results when I get the results. Now, in computer terms, that's still going to be very quickly, but my program has to wait. The JavaScript has to wait until the server has a chance to process the request and send the response. So what we're telling the pipeline is that anytime we get a response from the server, call this function. And that function is over here, handle response. And then we actually make the request. All right. We make the request. The server does its thing. We'll look at that in a minute here. And then we get a response back from the server. We actually get several responses from the server. And we can Google them to see what they are. This is sort of the status of the request. A value of 0 means the request has not been initialized yet. Number 1 is we've connected to the server. Number 2 is that we have sent the request and the server has received it. Number 3 means that the server is busy processing the request. And number 4 is that the server is finished and the response is ready. All right. There's more detail about the status of that, but usually we test only this. You can, however, test these as well. All right. So remember, this all happens in microseconds. All right. So when we make this request, before we make the request, the status or the ready state is 0. As we've connected to the server to make the request, it gets 1. When the server receives it, we get 2. When the server is processing it, we get a status back of 3. And finally, when the server is done processing, we get a request status of 4. Now, this function, handle response, gets called every time that ready state changes. So if we were to put an alert in here, we could do that. Or actually, I'm going to put a console log, which is maybe a better way to show it. I'm going to log to the console the ready state. So I put my request in. I look at the console, the JavaScript console. And I get 2, 3, and 4. It actually doesn't show the 0 and 1. It doesn't show the 0 because that's the initial state. I'm thinking it doesn't show the 1 because it happened so quickly that it blew past status of 1. But anyhow, we get called 2, 3, and 4. Now remember, we're not interested in any of those other ready states but 4, because 4 means it's finished. All right. And what do we do when the response is finished? When the request has been satisfied and the response has been made? We get back the data that we asked the server for in a variable called the pipeline or the request object's response text. And I'm going to set the inner HTML of the results field of this page equal to the text we got back from the response. So the answer from an Ajax request gets put here if we ask for the data to come in a certain format. This will not be true when we get to XML. When we get XML, the answer gets put someplace different. But in this case, we're just asking for plain text. And if it's plain text or if it's JSON text, we get the data back in the variable of the request object called response text. All right, so let's go over this before. We'll assume the page validates. We call make object call or make Ajax call. We define our URL. We establish the pipeline. We set our ready state change. By the way, this is probably when we got that status of 1 before we set the ready state change. So we establish the pipeline. We say, hey, every time we get a status update on that request object, call this function, handle response. And then we actually make the request and send the request. So it's going to send a request to the URL that's in this string. Let's log that so that we can see exactly what that URL is. So I'm going to log that to the JavaScript console so I can see exactly what that is. Here is the URL of the request that we made. Checkrange ajax.php question mark text stage equals 22 ampersand text beats equals 10. And that is correct. That's what we wanted to call. Let's spend a minute looking at this URL to make sure that we understand it. Check range is the name of the script that we want to use to process this request. Where is it at? It's in the same folder as our URL, so there's no folder in front of it. So we're looking for the script that is in the web server root called checkrange Ajax. All right. Then we define the query string. Remember, the query string is where we pass data to the server, where we can pass data to the server. All right. This is the same kind of format that we would get if we passed it via a normal request. So, for example, here, if I request a regular page, that's pretty much the URL that gets called. The only difference in it is we get the prefix of the local host. That's fine. That's what this is because we don't have anything before it. We're calling check range Ajax instead of check range period, but we're passing on the query string a question mark of text age 22, text beats, and the number of beats. So that's what this script is expecting. We're also not passing the button because the button is not a submit button, and we're not sending the button data to the script in the case of Ajax. So what do query strings look like? They start with a question mark. They then have sets of attribute names and values where they say attribute equals a value. So the attribute is text age. It equals 22. We use an ampersand to connect and put the second piece of data. So this is sending two pieces of data. One of them is called text age and has a value of 22. And one of them is text beats and has a value of 10. Now, here's something that we can do that's very valuable in testing. We can actually copy this and put this in our address we just have to remember the local host that goes in front of it. And we should see what the Ajax, what the PHP script is going to return for this Ajax request, because that's the URL that we requested. And sure enough, that's what we got back from the server. Notice how this is not a complete web page. We can view the source of it, and it's just literally that text, because this is not going to be an HTTP request when the Ajax engine makes it. It's going to be an XML HTTP request. And it doesn't return back a whole web page. It returns back only a piece of data. All right. Now, let's look at the check range Ajax. Notice what I do. I start off and I include the heart ink. That's a really good idea, right? Because I want my web page to be consistent. And heart ink is the place where all my calculations are. To refresh our memory from last time, calculate max rate, calculate minimum exercise rate, maximum exercise rate, and a function that returns whether it's in range or not, and sets the value to either -1, 1, or 0, depending if it's below the range, above the range, or within the range. So we're using in our Ajax request the same exact functions that we use, for example, when we create the table, when we create the chart. Therefore, we should get consistent results. All right. We wrote our functions well, and they're not coupled to the web page. That is, all the data they need, they get as arguments, and they return back a result. Then we can use that function in a variety of places. So we've used it so far in the table. We've used it in the traditional calculator. Now we're using it in the Ajax calculator. All right. So we define those functions. We get the value of age from the query string. What does txt age mean? That is the name that we call it on the query string. Likewise with txt beats. That's the name we called it on the query string. I'm going to initialize my error as an empty string. And I'm going to assume the page is valid until we get some indication. Now, I have my server-side validation code. This is very similar to the regular check range. I make sure that the age variable is set. I make sure the number of beats is set. I make sure the age is numeric. I make sure that the beats are numeric. If any of these are false, I add to my error message. That's what this syntax means. Take the error message and add to it the string and set be valid to false. Now, if you notice, this code is repeated from the non-Ajax version, which means that this would be good to probably take and put as a function and put it in an include file somewhere. A lot of times you can't identify where repeated code is, repeated code is going to be until you actually do the programming. So if this was my project and I noticed that, hey, this is the same as it's in the other one, I would go and make the alteration. Even though everything works, I would go to make it so that it works better. And I would create a function that did this validation and return to true or false and so on. That is known as refactoring. All right, refactoring is where you take code that works and you change it around a little bit to make it work better. All right, I'm not going to do that today for this. You know, it makes only a very small difference in this case. There's very little repeated code. So remember, this is the server-side script that is processing the Ajax request. It's not going to return a complete web page. It's only going to output either an error message or a message saying if they're in the optimal heart range or not. All right. If the result is -1, it prints to the client that you are in or below the optimal heart range. If it's equal to 0, they're in the optimal heart range. If it's negative, if it's +1, you are in or you're above the heart range. Finally, if there was an error, it's printing an error. Now, what does printing mean? Printing means that we're placing this value as part of the response text. My Google didn't understand that. It's listening to my lecture, and I'm just going to turn the volume down so it can search away at whatever it wants to search for. All right. So when we see print from within a script that was called as part of an Ajax request, print means add to the result text, or the response text rather, of the request. So this gets put in the result or response text. This does, or this does. And then finally, that gets returned. The status is 4. We take whatever that server script returns and put it in the area of the page called results. All right. I'd like to go over now some debugging techniques. And I sort of shown you some of these things already where I'm putting in the console logs. But let me show you where you're likely to be checking to see if there are issues or not. First of all, it's very useful to log the URL, at least while you're testing it. That is because if you're not calling the right script on the other end, then it's not going to work. Let me deliberately screw up the name of this name of the script. So if we put this in here, and saved it, and I try to go and enter that value in, I can't get results because it's calling the wrong script. In this case, I get a fairly descriptive error message. The requested URL was not found. But you might say, hey, I did that correct. Well, by logging it, you can look and see, is that the URL I expected it to be? And if I looked at it close, I'd say, oh no, the URL is wrong. Another area where that could be wrong is if I don't formulate the query string correctly. So if I omit that or omit that, same thing. I get an error saying that the requested URL was not found on the server. And also what I can do is I can look at the log to see what the URL was called. Now, this is a good tip if you know what the URL actually should look at. That's why I pointed out what the URL should actually look like. The name of the script, the question mark, and the values that that script needs, where you have the name of the value equals, and then the value, ampersand, and then the next one. So the first thing to do if it's not working is making sure that you're calling the right script on the client side. The client side is calling the right script on the server side. What's the next thing to do? So let's say I get this working. Hopefully I'll fix it. And let's say I screw these numbers up. And instead of 1, 0, negative 1, 0, and positive 1, I say 10, 8, and negative 10. Just a hypothetical error that I could be making. I could go and run this. And I get an error, invalid numeric literal in 33. Oh, I'm not allowed to do 0, 8. I don't get any response. All right. First thing to do, or one thing that you could do, is you could log the result text coming back from the client. So I could put in the client's function to make sure I'm really getting nothing back and that, you know, I don't have some error in my client side code. So I log that. look at the log. Sure enough, it shows me that there's an empty string coming back from the response text. Well, now what I have to do is now I know that the server-side script is not doing its job, in which case I can take this, paste it in here, and I don't get anything output from that. Then I know that the problem is inside my server-side script. What you want to do is you want to isolate where the problem is. Is it in the process of making a request? Is it in the process of handling the request on the server side? Or is it in the process of handling the response on the client side? So there's 3 points where this Ajax request can go wrong. 2 of them are in the client side code. That is creating the URL and handling the response. Because that's sort of the pattern for Ajax is the client side makes a request, forms a request, the server handles a request, the client side handles a response. So that's 2 places where it could go wrong. And if it's not one of those, it's probably in where the server side is handling the request. So take a systematic approach to narrow down where the errors are so that you make sure that it works. And you can see exactly what is not working. All right. If you come to me with a problem and say that, this Ajax code doesn't work, probably the first thing I'll ask you is, what have you logged into the console? And I'll make sure that you're logging something that's reasonable, and we'll see what that says, because that'll be a tip-off on where the likely problem is. I do want you to review the Jquery version of this. Even though on the first lab, you're not allowed to use the Jquery version. But for future reference, review the Jquery version. It uses the same server-side script. The only difference is if we look, the client-side script is a lot more straightforward. So here is all we need to do everything that all this code did in our original example. Well, there's even more code. All of this code did in the original example. And again, that's the whole idea of Jquery. It takes common functions and gives us a simple way to handle it. I do want you to understand the JavaScript version, because the JavaScript version, understanding that will help you understand exactly what's going on here. All right. Here is defining the URL. Here is making the request. Here is setting the function for if the request is finished, what we're doing with the results. It's just done in the Jquery syntax instead of the JavaScript syntax. All right, this is a very simple example. And what I mean by saying it's simple is that it only involves returning one value from the server. If we notice that Google example, we're not returning only one value We don't have to return only one value from the server. As I type something in here, I'm returning a list of things, like 10 or 12 of them. So we can return more than one thing from the server. And for each thing that we're returning for the server in the Google example, we're returning a URL along with the text description of that URL. So that'll be our focus next week, how we handle getting back from the server multiple pieces of data. And we have a couple of choices. Actually, we have kind of 3 choices to deal with that. And we'll be looking at that next time. Are there any questions? If you do have any questions concerning your lab and the stuff that you're working on, please let me know. We'll see you next week then. Take care.